Good afternoon and welcome to the 19th Century Charitable Association in Oak Park, where it is our vision to be a dynamic cultural center for community learning. I am Jackie Echolm, member of the Social Science Program Committee. Our program committees here at the 19th Century have scheduled 31 Enrichment Series events this season as part of our mission to strengthen our community through learning, giving, and sharing our landmark building. Today's presenter is David Wilson. He has been an Oak Park resident for 44 years and has lived in the western suburbs for 67 years, since 1958. His grandmother was a 19th Century Club member in the 1920s. David got his love of all things transportation early in life, as related in his baby book, where his parents noted they took 3-year-old David on trips to Philadelphia to ride subways, elevateds, trolleys, etc. These early experiences led him to live the dream with a half-a-century-long career in transportation. He worked in management with 4 railroads and a freight forwarder. He spent his last 9 years as a bus route planner for the Chicago Transit Authority. He holds a bachelor's degree in business administration and a master's of urban planning and policy degree, both with a focus on transportation. He has presented programs and written about a variety of transportation and community history topics. In 2021, he published From Garfield L to Blue Line Rapid Transit in collaboration with the Shoreline Interurban Historical Society. His forthcoming book, Towns Along the Q, will chronicle the history of the suburbs along the Metra BNSF train line between Chicago and Aurora. Publication is expected late in 2025. Please welcome David Wilson.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you all of you who have come out on a cold winter's day to learn about my nerdy topic, but I think you're going to find it to be interesting, about how the L and the train lines and the expressway are all down in that little trench between Harrison Street and Garfield in South Oak Park. We're going to start today with a pop quiz. We're looking at a picture here, and I want for someone to tell me, where is that person and what is she looking at? Okay, so it's at Oak Park Avenue and what's now the expressway. We don't know what her name is, but I'm going to call her Louise just because she needs a name. Louise is looking out at the construction site where they are digging out the trench. Somebody asked me, what's a trench? Isn't that something from World War I where you got down in it and shot at people? Well, yeah, it's kind of the same thing. The trench is where they just moved everything downstairs to be, the technical term is grade separated. Another thing from a personal perspective, she is looking out the window at the apartment building across the way. That's the apartment building, the building where Westgate Flowers is on the first floor. I used to buy flowers there for my then girlfriend, now wife of 41 years, Jackie. And I lived in the third floor all the way to the left, that 3 little windows there. I called it the Kerwin Observatory, and I'll tell you why in the program. So we're going to go and see what Louise was looking at and why it was important. So now we've turned it around. I'm now standing on Harrison Street looking back across, and you see the red brick buildings over the top of the Sioux Line locomotive. That's where Louise was sitting, up in one of those windows up there. So, as we've mentioned, this is all about the book From Garfield L to Blue Line Rapid Transit that was done in conjunction with the Shoreline Interurban Historical Society. I'd like to give a shout out to John Nicholson, who is the editor of this book, and he's in the crowd here someplace. John, wave your arm. There he is. Thank you, John, for the collaboration. So, here's the back of the book, and this is what's relevant to right there. The top picture, 1954, is looking east at Oak Park Avenue, and the down below is also looking east at Oak Park Avenue before and after they dug it out and put the L and the railroad and the highway down in the trench. So the relevant questions are, why are the railroad and the L and the highway there in the first place, and how did they get from the surface to the trench? And that's what we're going to spend a little over a half hour learning about. We're going to start out in 1856 when I'm going to back up to 1848, was when they built the more northerly, that dashed line there was the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad. The first railroad west of Chicago was opened in 1848, and shortly after that, competitors decided we're going to build a railroad to compete with that one, and the Galena and Chicago Union said, no, there's not enough people, there's not enough business to sustain two railroads. So the GNCU, which later became the Chicago and Northwestern and now is the Union Pacific that runs up on the embankment along North and South Boulevard, the GNCU bought out this competing railroad. The competing railroad, you see down here, St. Charles Air. St. Charles Airline was to be a railroad to go all the way to the Mississippi River, and they called it an airline all the way back in 1854 because it ran straight as an arrow flying through the air. And what was to have happened, it was to go straight on out, cross the Mississippi River at St. Charles, and then cross the Fox River and go on to the Mississippi River. When the GNCU bought it out, part of the point of it was so that it didn't build to the Mississippi River, but they still could use the train line to go down to 16th Street down in the city, which was a place that you really wanted your railroad to go to. So what they did, they built this little connecting line through what's now Forest Park, and you'll recognize the street pattern. That little curve up there, that's Circle Avenue. That's why they call it Circle Avenue. And the one going that way to the left is Brown Street that then goes up to connect with Des Plaines Avenue. But the important thing here is that they built this sloping railroad through a completely unsettled rural place. So that's why the expressway slopes the way it does. In 1886, then, the next chapter of this came along where the Chicago Great Western actually bought out that right-of-way and actually started using the one that went through St. Charles. And then coming down from the north, the Wisconsin Central Railroad that later became the Sioux Line, that became the Wisconsin Central again, came down, and the two of them, they joined at Forest Park and came down along that sloping piece of land where there was a little bit of development happening. In 1902, I'm going to back up. There was actually a suburban service that was operated in the 1890s. You could go from this little station, which was at Oak Park Avenue in Harrison, in front of Westgate Flowers that wasn't there. You could ride to downtown Chicago, or you could ride from that little station directly to the World's Columbian Exposition. In 1893. By the time this picture was taken, the station wasn't being used for anything, but it was, of course, still there. So, in 1902, another railroad came to town. This was the Aurora, Elgin, and Chicago interurban, electrically powered interurban train line from Aurora and Elgin, going to Chicago, hence its name, Aurora, Elgin, and Chicago. And it came down and then ran right alongside the existing train line down to where you see Terminal. That's at 52nd Avenue, which is now Laramie Avenue. And at that point, at that point. We're going to see what happened. We're going to see what happened in a moment. It connected with the Metropolitan West Side Elevated Railroad that we'll talk about in a moment. In the meantime, this is what the interurban looked like going through South Oak Park in the first decade of operation, sometime between 1902 and about 1910 or so. It was electrically powered with the third rail, just the way the L is now. And it's amazing that we went for decades and decades with minimal numbers of people getting electrocuted on the third rail, even though it was right at street level. 52nd Avenue is where the AE&C came down to this platform, and it connected with the Metropolitan West Side Elevated Railroad. There's one of their cars. And they, for 3 years, then the trains connected there until they executed an agreement whereby the AE&C could run all the way downtown on the elevated tracks to Wells Street, which you see right here, Wells Street, just north of Van Buren Street. And the L, the Metropolitan West Side Elevated Railroad, then could extend their L trains out to the big amusement park that used to be in Forest Park alongside Des Plaines Avenue, right where the Blue Line L terminal is now. So this is the map of the Metropolitan West Side Elevated Railroad that came out. You see Sacramento there where it does that little wiggle and squiggle, that's a technical term. And then along through Oak Park with stations at Austin, Lombard, Gunderson, Oak Park, Home, Harlem, and on to Des Plaines Avenue. At lunchtime today, we were talking about how the L from the 1920s until about 1948 or so, it actually went all the way out to Westchester. But that's a story for another day. So the important thing here is now you had the L coming through Oak Park. This is at Gunderson, the Gunderson Avenue platform. Apparently they didn't have long trains in those days. So with L service down there, the community grew, the railroad grew. This is the same Gunderson Avenue. Maybe in the late 1920s, you can see that real estate is active because of W.R. James. I remember the W.R. James real estate company here in Oak Park. The L and the train line, the AE&C, which by then had become the CA&E, had enough business and enough trains running that they actually built a little passing siding, a third track in the middle so that the CA&E trains could pass up the slower L trains. So it was, another thing I want to point out in this picture that will become important later on. The railroad line is over to the right, and every street there's a tower there. That every single street crossing had to have a full-time 24-hour watchman who would put the gates down. They didn't have electric gates and flashing lights and all that stuff. Many of you might remember at Lake Street, before they moved the L in 1962, before they moved it up onto the embankment, we had those air operating gates on South Boulevard that also, they had a watchman there 24 hours a day to put the gates down. So just take note of the fact that those towers are there. So this is what it looked like. This is at Oak Park Avenue in 1935. The two railroads having a somewhat wide right-of-way, but nobody had really given any thought to putting a highway there. So this is an aerial view of the same place. That was my little place there. I forgot to point out when I showed that little wooden suburban station, in the 1890s, the neighborhood was called Kerwin. It was the Kerwin subdivision. And because my windows looked out over the expressway, I called my apartment the Kerwin Observatory. 1930s. It was a bustling place. You wouldn't know the Great Depression was underway, considering the very well-dressed people coming off, they've just must have just gotten off of an L train, are now walking to their houses and apartments in South Oak Park. But one of the things that you're seeing in this picture that you didn't see in the others is automobiles. Yes, automobiles. Automobiles, by right after World War I, everybody wanted to use an automobile, and if there was any way that they could, they would drive their automobile downtown instead of taking the L or the or other train lines. And the streets got amazingly congested. Jackson Boulevard and Washington Boulevard were just practically parking lots between Oak Park and downtown Chicago, even by the early 1920s. So, what's to do about it? We're going to have a superhighway. A superhighway was in 1928. That was the idea of having lanes and then other lanes divided with what was called limited access. Instead of having street intersections, you would have the cross streets would go on bridges. So we're going to have a Congress Street superhighway, as so said the Tribune in March of 1928. But by August of 1928, yeah, we still want to do the superhighway, but it's going to be in different places. And in fact, the city, the civic leaders, the business leaders in Chicago and Oak Park dithered for a decade, arguing among themselves. Everybody knew they wanted one, but nobody could agree on where to put this superhighway. So, what changed everything was in 1937, the city of Chicago wanted federal funding to build the State Street subway, which now the Red Line. So the Edward Kelly administration, Mayor Edward Kelly, his staff, filed a grant application with the Public Works Administration. That was one of the Franklin Roosevelt Depression era alphabet agencies to stimulate economic activity and give people jobs. They wanted a federal grant to do the State Street subway and a pair of streetcar subways. So they filed the application. But they filed the application with Harold Ickes. Harold Ickes was a reform Republican in a Democratic administration, and he absolutely detested the Kelly administration. He was actually from Chicago. His brother actually worked in the city administration. He lived in Winnetka, but was in D.C. being the PWA and also the Secretary of the Interior. So he received the grant application and just was practically receiving it through set teeth, but he had to do it because we had delivered a huge majority for Franklin Roosevelt in the 1936 election and could be reasonably expected to do so in the 1940 election. So basically, Franklin Roosevelt, his boss, said, give him the money. And he just had a hard time with that. So what he approved was not what they asked for. He approved money for the State Street subway, not for the streetcar subways, but he said, no, I'm going to give you more money. I'm going to give you money for the Milwaukee-Dearborn subway. We'll talk about that in a moment. But only if, and this is where the story really gets started, the West, if you guys will stop dithering and decide where to build the highway, in fact, no, I'm going to decide for you. You are going to build it along Congress Street. If you want the money, that's what you're going to do. The second thing is we want the highway and transit planning to be coordinated. And the third thing was, by this time, the Metropolitan West Side Elevated was actually the Chicago Rapid Transit. The streetcars were run by the Chicago Surface Lines. Both had gone into bankruptcy and were just kind of limping along. But the requirement that they be consolidated ultimately led to the foundation of the CTA, Chicago Transit Authority, my former employer, in 1947. So, on we went. And Ickes, as I mentioned, was responsible then for getting the money for the Milwaukee Avenue subway that turns and came along on Dearborn Street. And at the beginning, it actually didn't get opened until about 1951. But you'll see on this map, there's the Garfield Park L going out the way it had since the turn of the century. Congress Street, why Congress Street? Because the Burnham Plan of 1909 had already identified that central red line going up there as the logical place for a boulevard or a parkway to go out to the western suburbs. That X all the way up at the top is it's basically where Columbus Park is. So, now, here's the problem. We're going to build a subway, we're going to build a highway where the Garfield Park L is. The Garfield Park L ran right along Congress Street. Okay, now, exactly how are we going to do this? We can't have an L and a highway at the exact same place. How's this going to work? So let's think about some options here. This is in Berwyn, where on Cermak Road you had lanes of traffic, a train line or the streetcar line, and lanes of traffic. How about we put the L in the middle of the lanes of traffic? Well, that's an interesting concept. I love this image. I think this came from a promotion of the 1909 Burnham Plan. Which somebody's concept in what the world will look like in 1950 with hay wagons and horse-drawn wagons and a couple of some of those gas buggies. But it illustrated that people were already thinking about this, putting the train line in the middle of the expressway. Out in DuPage County in the 1920s, the county already envisioned coordination where Butterfield Road, if you ever go out on Butterfield Road, notice how really, really wide it is. The lanes are wide, but then there's all this property on either side. In the 1920s, the highway department purchased land for a 200-foot wide right-of-way for Butterfield Road to have lanes of traffic and really elegant 1920s houses and the train line going down the middle of the highway. Okay, yeah, I guess maybe we can do this. So this, by the way, was to have been a bypass for the Chicago Aurora and Elgin to go past the suburbs closer in so that they could provide faster service out to the Fox River. So coming back to the city, okay, let's just do it. So this is what the original artist concept was looking like for what was going to be then the Congress Expressway and the L. So on we went. They acquired land starting right after World War II, demolished the buildings, displaced a lot of people's homes and businesses. This is at Ogden Avenue, so County Hospital would be off to the left here. You can see that most of the buildings are gone. But now here's the next dilemma. Now we know we're going to put the L in the middle. What are we going to do with the L while the excavation is taking place? So the plan was developed to move the L way over to the side down in the city alongside Van Buren Street, dig it out, put the L down, put the pavement in, and get on with our lives. And this is what it looked like from 1953 to 1958, the L was squished over to the side. This was a former streetcar track that wasn't being used, but then here's the L. For 3 miles, they had to stop at every single crossing. And then you'll see there's County Hospital over on the right, and you'll see that wooden fence. That is they're already starting the excavation for the subway. So that's what it looked like, as I say, from 1953 to 1958. Though by 1954, excavation was well underway. The temporary L tracks are up there along those buildings. 1955, his honor, the mayor, Richard J. Daley, came out to swing the mallet on a 90-plus degree day to drive the first spike for the Congress rapid transit line. And this is, by 1955, they were coming pretty well along with the first track and the pavement, and it's starting to come together down in the city. In June 22nd, 21st, help me out, John, was 1st or 21st or 22nd? 22nd, like it makes a difference. They opened the new, in the middle of the highway, L line, but only to Laramie Avenue. At Laramie Avenue, it just kept doing what it had been doing since the turn of the century in Oak Park. Why is that? Because it was a city expressway only when it was originally planned. That's what Mayor Kelly gave us the money for, was just to get out as far as Columbus Park. The expressway would open, and the plan was just to dump all that traffic onto Jackson Boulevard or Washington or Madison Street. If you were living in Oak Park in those days, you probably wouldn't have liked that very much. So that's not what happened. What happened was, by 1945, they realized, no, this is much bigger than just the city. And so the Tribune is reporting in October an extension of the Congress Street superhighway from Austin Boulevard to the county line. So now the Oak Park bulb lights up. Now, what are we going to do about it? Remember that the A, E, and C in 1902 had built down there, so they owned the land on half of that strip going down from Des Plaines Avenue down to Laramie Avenue. Now, I mentioned that the railroad was running alongside. The railroad was overjoyed with this because they won't have to pay for all of those crossing guards anymore. But the CA and E by then, they saw a gold mine worth more dead than alive. This is an article from the Tribune talking about the management of the CA&E controlled by a syndicate of 150 Kansans. Well, what do people in Kansas care about our suburban train line? They figured out this thing's right in the path of the expressway. They lost money every day carrying passengers, but that's okay because as long as they're in the path of the expressway, they can hold the Cook County Highway Department hostage for more and more and more and more money to pay to them to get out of that right-of-way. And it delayed the project for years. They were absolutely tough negotiators. I wish I could tell you more about this because the games that this company played, the CA&E, that they try to pass themselves off as victims. They weren't victims at all. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they extracted every nickel they could out of the constructing public. So eventually, though, by 1953, they came to terms, and the Highway Department had to pay a pile of money to get that part through to pay for that part through Oak Park. Now the problem was, well, the CA&E thing, they kept the CA&E management said, well, we want to figure out how to run to downtown Chicago. You're depriving us of our ability to carry passengers. No, this was all a game. They were all the time planning not to run passenger trains anymore, but they also wanted to keep their right-of-way as long as they could. But they finally came to terms where they would sell the land to the Highway Department, and then the CTA would extend the L that was already running on it. They would take over all of the operation, and they would cut it back to Des Plaines Avenue so that they didn't have to run the trains on that temporary track down through the city. It's actually much more complicated, and I encourage you to buy the book because you get to hear about all of the histrionics that went into that negotiation. So This is out at Des Plaines Avenue, where the Blue Line terminal is now. It used to be that the train came where the amusement park used to be and just went on down into the city. They had a place to turn around the L trains and just go to the city. Once they didn't run the trains downtown, they developed this loop-in-loop arrangement whereby the CTA trains came out around this big loop and the CA&E trains ran around the little loop. This is what it looked like in vision. The old L train is going around on the trestle on the big loop over the little loop. In 1957, the CA&E they received regulatory approval to discontinue the train service, but even that was utterly not graceful. There was a court injunction that said, no, you have to keep running it. But the court injunction ran out at about maybe 11:30 a.m. on July 3rd, 1957. The commuters had ridden down in the morning. They had gotten off the train. They got on the L train and went to downtown. And in the middle of the day, at precisely 12:13 p.m., they said, this is it, we're done. They never even told the CTA. They took the train that was parked at the platform and just zoomed it out to Wheaton where the train yards were, and that was it. The commuters came out in the afternoon and there's no train. It's 4th of July weekend. What am I supposed to do? And that's another story for another day. But these were a graceless bunch of people. So now where does that leave us? It leaves us in Oak Park with a completed expressway and a completed expressway out here, because it was really easy to build the expressway out through Maywood and Melrose Park. If you notice when you drive out there, it's almost at street level. They have to go down under some bridges, but it was very simple compared to the city to how to build this part out here. But the part in the middle had been stuck because of the CA&E and because we're going to talk in a moment about the removal of the John, how many graves was that? 3,000? About 3,000 people. In order to expand this right-of-way here through the cemeteries, they had to disinter over 3,000 graves. They had to find the loved ones, the survivors, and get new places to bury them. So it was a very challenging thing. But by 1957, now we're going to get on with it here. This is down at Central Avenue. Loretto Hospital is over here on the left. You can see the completed expressway to Laramie Avenue, and you can see the train line coming out from Laramie Avenue where they used to meet way back when. And then the train line, the L and the train line then are going to wander through a construction site for the next long time, couple years. This is in Oak Park. Taken from a helicopter that's more or less over Harlem Avenue looking east. So that is Oak Park Avenue right there. And you'll see that they are now moving the tracks over to the side the same way they did in the city, and the excavation has started. They're propping up the wooden things for the retaining wall along Garfield Street, but the whole thing got replicated from the way it was done in the city, but more complicated than in the city, because in the city you didn't have two train lines, you just had the one. And in the city you had a wider right-of-way. So Oak Park, it was a real shoehorning act to do this with a minimum removal of houses. To my knowledge, there were probably less than 25 houses that got removed as a result of this project. So one of the complexities of all this, you had the train line, the L and the train coming out, but they needed to put in a crossing at Kenilworth Avenue. You see that little X right there? That's the train crossing stuff for moving the railroad over to the other side of the L. So just if you lived around there, it had to have been miserable for a couple of years listening to all of the construction. But there we have it, the diagram showing how the train line split over to the other side, and I'll show you why in a moment. This is what it looked like on the ground where they were putting in this crossing work here. What was happening here, those are going to be the new temporary L tracks. These are going to be the new temporary railroad tracks. These are the existing L tracks. And so for a couple of years, they kept moving the tracks back and forth this way and that. Here's the train coming across that temporary crossing at Kenilworth Avenue. These really depict what the process was, that this was the original L line, those were the original train line. They built a whole separate little temporary L line over there. Then they're going to take the train line and run the trains, the freight trains, on these tracks while they dig out everything over there. And so away we went. This is the same situation looking at Oak Park Avenue, right to left, temporary train tracks, the old train tracks, and then the soon-to-be removed freight train tracks that'll be moved over here so they can dig out where the West Towns bus is over there. Des Plaines Avenue was a construction site for 2 years where they constantly had to move stuff back and forth. They rearranged this terminal multiple times because when you go on Des Plaines Avenue, it goes down underneath the train tracks. Well, it used to be at surface level. Think about what it takes now. Every time that you were going to dig it out, you would have to move the street so that you could dig, and you would have to move the train tracks because you had to put the bridge in there. So you see where those cars are parked, that's Des Plaines Avenue. The thoroughfare became Beloit Avenue, a little to the east of there. Here's the loop and loop thing, and the new bridges are getting put into place. The train tracks have been moved over to the side, which was the reason you had that X-type crossing back there. And Ted and Joanne's house is just about here. So welcome to your new home. So this is the same helicopter looking the other direction. We talked about the moving the grades. So they had to widen what had been just a little right-of-way between the Concordia Cemetery and the Forest Home Cemetery, make it big enough to get the expressway through there. But the other thing that was going on here, that whole business about the CA&E holding them hostage, the CA&E said, well, you got to build our tracks back in because we might start up operations someday. And the highway department had to pay for brand new train tracks that went out to, that's First Avenue in the background. You can see the completed expressway. Pay for brand new train tracks that were never used. The only use that they ever got was when you go on the expressway, you see where the CTA has got trains that are kind of parked back there. They're kind of right along there. But otherwise, that was, all that construction was just because CA&E was calling the highway department's bluff. So I mentioned that they had to get through there, and there was something like 3,400 graves that had to be moved. So it took a really long time. They wanted this whole thing to be done. The civic officials wanted this done by 1955, and we're now in 1958. So here's Louise. This is why Louise is sitting where she is, and she's looking out at the relocated train line, squished hard against, that's another technical term, squished, hard against Harrison Street. She's looking out at the temporary wooden bridge, Oak Park Avenue bridge, across the excavation. This is what Harlem Avenue looked like. This had been the old train lines. Can you imagine now getting a picture where you would have long enough to take a picture without 100 cars going by? But this was, that's what later, it was the Borden factory later became Ferrera and Ferrera Pan. So by 1959, we're getting there. We're getting there. The temporary train tracks are up there. They're now doing the excavation. This is where you had seen that retaining wall in the overhead view. That's Suburban Trust and Savings Bank at Oak Park Avenue. So we're making real progress. By August of 1959, the first tracks were being laid. It was pretty funny. They would lay tracks here and over here and over here, but they couldn't do it continuously because they were still building the temporary bridges and then the permanent bridges, and then they would stitch the tracks together later in the fall of 1959. By December of 1959, now it's really coming together. The soon-to-be used train tracks are down in the trench. These are going to be the new L tracks, and then the temporary tracks are still being used up above. It's starting to take a little bit more shape, also in December at Oak Park Avenue, the long sloping ramps that seemed like a good idea at the time. They've very much gone out of favor now, but they actually did anticipate somewhat the Americans for Disabilities Act, though I wouldn't want to be in a wheelchair and have your brakes fail going down that thing. So by early 1960, the freight trains are still up above, but this is the Austin platform with that little walkway that goes over to the Lombard Avenue entrance is now pretty much in place. The new train tracks are in place. They still had stitching to do out at Des Plaines Avenue and down at Laramie Avenue, but that day is coming soon. You'll see up on the upper right, there's the old temporary L platform with the lights still on because they're still using the temporary tracks. March 19th was cutover date. That construction site down near Central Avenue, you'll see now that the L is coming off the new part of the L onto the old temporary tracks, but they've already laid the new ones, and they actually moved then the train crossing down there. These are going to be the new down in the trench train tracks over there. So this is the transitional picture. This is presumably the last train to come along the old temporary train tracks because the guys are already out there with their picks and shovels and ready to snip those tracks and attach them right there so that we can start running in the trench. March 21st, my brother's 14th birthday, the trains were now running down in the trench, but things weren't finished. It was a goofy situation where the Oak Park permanent bridge wasn't complete yet. So the people had to walk on the wooden bridge that Louise had been looking at. They had to walk down underneath the under construction bridge, then go up a flight of stairs, and then come down the rest of this ramp to get to their train platform. Woe be it if you're about to miss your train. This is what it looked like from the other side at the same time, where you came down the wooden stairway, went down underneath, came up, and then finally got to your train. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, imagine that you're running for your train and this big old locomotive just shows up right in front of you because the L is already downstairs, but the freight train line is still upstairs, and it's also not good if you can see your L coming and now this big old slow freight train is going to make you wait. So, May 3rd, 1960, they moved the freight trains down into the trench. So now both the L and the freight trains are down in the trench, but you still have where the temporary track had been, and this is the thing that leaves me absolutely breathless about this entire project. In November of 1960, there was a presidential election, a gubernatorial election, and all kinds of other elections, and all of the elected officials said, we want the expressway open. We don't want it to be a construction site. It's going to be open. Do you understand that? Oh, okay, now let's count. June, July, August, September, October, November. You've got 6 months to turn that into an expressway. And they did. So this is opening day of the expressway, October 12th, 1960. Governor Stratton arrived by helicopter, and they had all the appropriate speeches about what a wonderful thing it is that all this has happened. This is more or less at East Avenue, Lombard Avenue. You can see the ramp going up. The narrowness of the right-of-way and the desire not to remove any more people's homes that was absolutely necessary was why we have those left-hand exits and entrances. If the expressway ever gets rebuilt, they're going to do away with that. But that's what we've had now since 1960. Now, I said that they did that hurriedly. The expressway is now open, but barely. There is no lane striping. The shoulders aren't done. There's no lighting, no signage. They pushed that thing through, saying we gotta be able to have bragging rights here. This one is at about East Avenue. Another thing about the expressway, you notice at East Avenue, unlike the other crossings where it's just a bridge, there's that whole big kind of thing in the middle of the expressway. There was going to be an expressway entrance and exit at East Avenue. And the Village of Oak Park said, we don't want that kind of traffic being dumped into the interior of Oak Park. And so that stands as a mute monument to the foresight of the clout of the Village of Oak Park to stop that project from happening. So what we have then is coming back to this picture that you see from, I think I might have taken this picture from the window of the Kerwin Observatory, looking back across where Louise had been looking out the window. By now, this is about 1983, and the permanent entrance to the L is open, the L is going by, the trains are going by, and the project is complete. So this is what it looked like a couple of months ago. I just was standing on the little bike crossing at Home Avenue of the railroad and the L and the expressway as they presently exist. So in summary, you have just seen a project that started in 1954 and now what it looked like in 2020 and everything that happened in between. So I want to thank you, 19th Century Charitable Association and Shoreline Interurban Historical Society for providing the resources to get this published and for me to stand up here and share with you what all happened to get from 1954 to the present. So I want to thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that wonderful presentation. Could you talk a little bit about what's coming in the future for this artery that you've described the history of?
For the expressway and the expansion?
Yes.
So there's a public policy issue that's kind of a problem that it's called induced demand, where when you build an expressway, you will just, all it'll do is just fill up again. But nonetheless, politically, it's going to be kind of appropriate to add lanes to the expressway because if anybody driven on it, you know it's jammed a lot of the time. But in order to do that, they're stuck in this really narrow trench, and there are some subtleties there. You can't have a platform, you can't have an elevator at the Oak Park Avenue platform because the trench is so narrow that you would have to widen the platform in order to get space for the elevator. But also there's scarcely room to add lanes on either side of that. So the world is kind of holding its breath with regards to that train line down there. That anybody who knows about River Forest knows that the trains used to go up along through River Forest and up to North Avenue. That the way the trains are configured now, they don't go that way anymore, but the railroad doesn't want to exactly let go of that because we might need it in the future. And once you've let go of a train line, you're never going to get it put back. So it's a stalemate in terms of, yeah, we could remove the train tracks and make a little more space, but the railroad doesn't want to do that. And actually the elephant in the room with that, there's no money to do it. It would require a really lot of money, and it's not there right now. So the plans are sitting out there. The engineering plans are there and have been actually for the better part of a decade already. And it's, I'm going to quote one of my favorite philosophers, Yogi Berra. Yogi Berra once said that making predictions is always difficult, especially when it involves the future.
What the heck happened to the Great Western? And how did that affect the plans?
So the Chicago Great Western was the one that extended straight west on the right-of-way that would have been the Chicago, St. Charles and Mississippi Airline. It ran until 1968 when history repeated itself. The CNNW Railroad bought the Chicago and Great Western and rerouted the trains that had been on the Great Western onto the ones that go across on the embankment between North and South Boulevard. And there were some local industries that little by little stopped being there. So at that point, the Chicago Great Western that went straight west got turned into a hiking trail called the Great Western Trail.
A clarification regarding why they stopped at, they didn't build an off-ramp at East Avenue. As I remember it, there were 1,200 students in Ascension School, 1 block north of Congress, and Monsignor Fitzgerald fought like heck to prevent that traffic because 1,200 students walk to and from school twice a day. And that's the reason that Oak Park really was willing to prevent that access, that egress then. Is that what you understand too?
I hadn't heard that, but it makes absolute perfect sense. I should, though, mention, as long as you talked about that, a lot of people kind of wrung their hands about having this thing down in the trench instead of the way it was. It actually was a huge benefit because the Ascension kids, before it went in the trench, they had to walk across both the train line and the L line to get to church, to class. And woe be it if one of those freight trains comes along just at the moment that you're trying to get to class. That would be your excuse for being late.
Maybe you can clarify something I had heard many years ago, that the state of Illinois and the U.S. government paid to actually construct the Eisenhower Expressway, and that the city of and the hauler who hauled all that soil away then sold it to the city of Chicago for landfill. Do you know that?
There's nothing that you said there that I wouldn't, I basically agree with the whole thing in concept. Originally, there was the federal grant and the city money to build the expressway partway out. A lot of people like to talk about the Interstate Highway Program and how that changed everything. No, the Congress Expressway was effectively completely built before the Interstate Highway Act was passed. So it was state gas tax money that paid for actually paid for the construction of the highway. And that is a regular process whereby when you tear up old stuff, it goes to one of those grinding up places like you'll see down along the Stevenson Expressway, and then gets turned into construction aggregates that, then the contractor can resell it back to the state to build another highway somewhere else.
Was the process that you described for building the Eisenhower, was it similarly complicated for the expressways that came later, like the Kennedy, or I guess at that time it was called the Northwest Expressway, the Edens, the Stevenson later? Was there similar problems about the narrow right-of-way for the trench?
Not so much with the narrow right-of-way, because this was the only place that I can think of where they were trying to shoehorn both of them into a close space. But for some of the other ones, there's the much-discussed Dan Ryan Expressway that it depends on which lens you want to look at it through, whether it deliberately went through the land of already disadvantaged people, or was the highway department just, we got a budget, this is the cheapest land we can get, we're going to do it. But to answer your question about some of the other places, on the near north side, the Northwest Expressway makes a big bow around, help me out, John, the name of the Catholic Church. Saint Stanislaus and Holy, they're the two churches where the diocese had enough clout that they actually had to reroute both the expressway and the adjacent train line around those two churches. So there are similar examples of where complications arose.
I grew up in River Forest as a kid with a backyard that faced the Sioux Line tracks. Can you tell me what happened or why there were Sioux Line tracks, where they came from and where they went?
Yes. 1886, the Wisconsin Central Railroad built through there, and they just ran there for years and years. In about 1909 or so, the Sioux Line Railroad, there was a merger of companies in northern Wisconsin and Michigan that caused the old Wisconsin Central to become the Sioux Line. And it was the Sioux Line then from 1909 or so, maybe 1906, all the way up to in 1983, the Sioux Line Railroad Corporation bought the Milwaukee Road Railroad that runs up along Grand Avenue with that really icky crossing on Grand Avenue. But when they bought the Milwaukee Road, they were able to reroute all of the freight trains from Chicago onto the Milwaukee Road, which left the part down the trench with hardly any trains down there. But then in 1987, a new Wisconsin Central Railroad bought the old Sioux Line tracks before the Sioux Line bought the Milwaukee Road and reactivated it. And in fact, I worked for the new Wisconsin Central for 6 weeks short of the entire history of the company. So then the tracks were used very much so, thanks in part to my sales ability to get people onto to ship on it, until the new Wisconsin Central got bought by the Canadian National in 2001. And the Canadian National then later bought the Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern Railroad so that they could reroute the trains way around the periphery of the city out near Barrington and places. And so once again, your tracks through River Forest fell silent. And that's where the tension is right now. They'll run a train down there every now and then just to remind people, especially realtors, who are going to tell people who want to buy houses like yours, oh, there's no trains here. Well, we don't know that. That's what we would have said in 1985, too. But so it sits there in limbo. Maybe we'll use it someday, maybe not. And that then comes back to the question about, the other thing is, do you remember when there was a Capitol Dome logo on the Des Plaines Avenue Bridge across the expressway? Well, that was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. It was a complex series of transactions going back to the 1890s, but the trains that come out now on the CSX are neither the Sioux Line nor the Chicago Great Western, but a whole nother company that you could do a whole program on just what happened in 1890 to 1893 to cause the railroads to have their configuration they did. Did I tell you more than you really wanted to know? While she's walking back there, I will put in a plug for the book that tells a more detailed story than what I could do in 35 to 40 minutes here. And also put in a plug for my book that is going to come out later in the year about the suburbs along the train line from Chicago to Aurora, and why each suburb is quite different from the one next to it. What are all of the historic circumstances that cause Riverside to be different from Berwyn, and LaGrange to be different from Brookfield, and so on.
I have a question about the shape, a curve in 290 at about Independence.
Where it does a little, another technical term, a wiggle and squiggle.
How is that created? Was that another cardinal or somebody intervening for their students, or a church, or religion, or factory?
I certainly am familiar with the curve, and without looking at a map and really looking at it carefully, I really can't tell you why that wiggles and squiggles the way it does. As I say, that's an urban planning term.
Yourself, what I don't recall, you said it and I still don't understand. Could you briefly describe again why when you're coming out and, the exits in Oak Park are in the center and not to the side?
Right. Why are the exits in the center instead of to the side? That to do the side exits would have required taking out houses and apartment buildings right there, and you'd have to go back and really look at the photographs, or a good question to put to the Oak Park Historical Society. But basically, you needed to squeeze this all into this little space and not take any more land than you absolutely needed to. I think they've regretted it ever since. And one other thing with that, I didn't include the diagram of this, but there was one proposal for the top of the ramp at Harlem to actually have a traffic circle. This was all the way back in the 1950s. They proposed to have a traffic circle. You'd come up to the top of this ramp, and you'd have to whip around this traffic circle.
Okay, let's give David one more round of applause, and thank you.